Today on Go Ahead Ask the Taxpayer, do you have to own your relinquished property and your replacement property in the exact same name through a 1031 exchange? Not necessarily. Let's talk about it on Go Ahead Ask.
Building wealth in real estate? Let the Exeter Group take the mystery out of how it's done on Go Ahead Ask.
Welcome to Go Ahead Ask podcast by the Exeter Group, where we unravel the mysteries of investment real estate. Our goal is to provide investors with better quality education so that you can make better informed investment decisions. I'm Bill Exeter, your host for today's podcast. We encourage questions here at Go Ahead Ask. So send your questions, send your topics, or even send information on you if you'd like to appear on our podcast to ask@exeterco.com. That's ask@exeterco.com. If you love Go Ahead Ask, please like it, subscribe to it, and share it with all of your friends and family. Today's podcast is Unraveling the Mysteries of 1031 Exchanges, specifically the taxpayer. One of our listeners asked, I've been told that I have to acquire legal title to my new replacement property through a 1031 exchange in the exact same name that I held legal title to my relinquished property. Is that true? We're going to unravel that mystery today. First, our next episode is going to be covering qualified opportunity zone investment funds. So stay tuned for that in 2 weeks, and we'll unravel that mystery as well. Now, let's unravel the mystery of 1031 exchanges and the taxpayer. You know, lots of people will ask, I hold legal title to my property that I'm going to sell in either my living trust or in my individual name or in an LLC, maybe a partnership. Do I have to do the 1031 exchange and acquire the replacement property in the exact same legal name? And there's a lot of confusion out there about this because a lot of the closing agents and settlement agents will tell you you have to have the exact same legal title on both sides. And that's not exactly true. It's not the legal title that is really the issue. The issue is we have to make sure it's the same taxpayer. The individual or the entity that is considered the taxpayer that is selling the relinquished property needs to be considered the same taxpayer, same entity that acquired the replacement property. But there's various deviations from that might apply to your situation. So for example, you might own real estate today in a living trust, and you go to sell that, you're structuring a 1031 exchange, you go to finance the property, your new replacement property, and the lender says, we won't do a loan in the name of your trust. You have to take title as individuals and then convey title into your trust the day after. Does that qualify? You may have a situation where you hold title in an LLC and you sell out of the LLC, you structure a 1031 exchange, you go to buy replacement property, kind of the same thing. The lender says, I'm not going to lend to an LLC. You have to take title as individuals. I will lend to you as individuals, and then you convey title into the LLC. You may have individuals selling the relinquished property, and they want to go buy a partnership or into a partnership. So those are examples of what we see kind of most common day to day. And those are really the questions. Do each of those individually qualify? So I wanted to break it down by type of entity. So the first example I gave was you're selling property that you hold in a living trust, and you go to buy your replacement property through the 1031 exchange, and the lender says, we're not going to finance to a living trust. So does that qualify as a 1031 exchange if you take title as individuals, so the lender's happy, and then the day of or the day after you convey title into the living trust? And the answer is, in most cases, yes, but we have to drill down. We have to understand who is the taxpayer. That's the real issue. So most living trusts are considered fully revocable grantor trusts. It's a fancy name. It means that the trust is, a family trust or a living trust. It can be terminated, altered, amended, or revised at any time. So you want to make sure that your CPA or your attorney takes a look at it and verifies that it is a fully revocable grantor trust. That means it's disregarded for tax purposes. It exists from a legal perspective, it gives you all the benefits of estate planning, etc. But for tax purposes, it's ignored. So even though you own title in a living trust, for tax purposes, it's treated as if you own title in your individual name. That's the same whether it's an individual or a husband and wife. So going back to the example, if you're selling as a living trust and it is a fully revocable grantor trust and is a disregarded entity, then really it's treated as if you're selling as individuals. So when you do the 1031 exchange, you go to buy your replacement property and the lender says we will not lend to a living trust, take title as individuals. That's okay in that situation because you're treated as selling as individuals. So now you can buy as individuals. And then after closing, the day of, the day after, whenever, you can convey title into the living trust. So that's perfectly okay. Now, if the trust is not a fully revocable grantor trust, if it's an irrevocable trust, that's a very different animal that we have to be careful with. So make sure that it is fully revocable, it is a grantor trust, and it is disregarded for tax purposes. The next example was you're selling property out of an LLC and you go to buy your replacement property in the LLC. And again, the lender says, no, we're not willing to finance inside of an LLC. You could take title as individuals, we'll finance as individuals, and then you can convey title into the LLC. Does that qualify? It's my favorite answer. It depends. If the LLC is a single member LLC, so you are the sole member of that LLC, and you have not elected anything special so that the LLC is treated as a disregarded entity. And that's really the issue. That's the important point. It has to be a disregarded entity for tax purposes. Then really it's treated as if you are selling the real estate as an individual, even though you hold legal title in an LLC. So when you go to acquire your replacement property through the 1031 exchange, you can acquire title as an individual. The lender can finance in your individual name. The lender's happy. And then right after that, you can convey title into the same LLC. It's a single member LLC. It's disregarded for tax purposes. It's treated as if you sold as an individual, you bought as an individual. It qualifies for 1031 exchange treatment. Now, let's take that same example, but let's apply it to a husband and wife scenario. If the husband and wife are the sole members of the LLC and they live in a community property state, then in most cases there's an IRS ruling specifically on point that says a husband and wife that live in a community property state are considered to be a single member LLC and a disregarded entity. So the exact same example, if they're selling as an LLC and it is a community property state, then they're considered selling as individuals. They can again acquire the replacement property as husband and wife as individuals. Lender will lend to the individuals, the lender's happy, and then you convey into the LLC. However, if you live in a non-community property state, the IRS ruling is silent. And so we assume that if you're in a non-community property state, you have one LLC and the husband and wife are the sole members, it is very likely going to be treated and is a partnership. So in that case, you now have a separate tax-paying entity. It's not a disregarded entity, and it is treated as if an entity, a partnership, sold the real estate, so the same partnership has to acquire that real estate. So again, we have to drill down and ask the question, who is the real taxpayer? So it's not necessarily who's on legal title, it's who is the taxpayer. Next example is you're selling as an individual or you're selling as a husband and wife. You do a 1031 exchange and you go to buy replacement property, and the target property that you really like is maybe a larger asset, maybe it's a syndication, something along that lines, and you decide, I want to acquire this property. But the only way to invest in that project or that development or that asset is to buy into an LLC or to buy into a partnership. That generally will not qualify because what you're buying is a membership interest or a partnership interest in an entity, and the entity actually owns the real estate. So as an individual, you're not buying real estate, you're buying an investment interest in some type of an entity. So again, we have to drill down and ask, who is the taxpayer? In this case, if you're selling as individuals, the individuals are the taxpayer. If you're buying the replacement property in a partnership, then you as individuals did not buy real estate, that will not qualify for 1031 exchange treatment. There are all sorts of variations here. So the key message here is to make sure that you meet with your tax advisor, ask the question, who is the taxpayer? Do I have a disregarded entity? Things like that. We'd be happy to jump on a conference call with them and go through those specific questions, because that is critical. There are a couple of other entities I wanted to mention real quick because they also can qualify for 1031 exchange treatment. So we talked about the fully revocable grantor trust. We talked about living trust, a fully revocable grantor trust. We talked about single member LLCs that are disregarded entities. Folks also hold title to real estate in land trusts, or sometimes referred to as title holding trusts. That is basically a fully revocable grantor trust, assuming it truly is a land trust, and a beneficial interest in that land trust is considered to be a disregarded entity and will qualify for 1031 exchange treatment. In fact, there's a specific IRS ruling on land trusts. So if you're selling your current property that's held in a land trust and you're conveying title by assigning the assigning the beneficial ownership interest in that land trust to the buyer, that's considered a sale or conveyance of title of real estate for tax purposes. So that will qualify for 1031 exchange treatment. You do not have to buy in the same land trust or even in a land trust. If you're the sole beneficiary of the land trust or one of the beneficiaries and you've sold your interest, you can acquire your replacement property as a beneficial interest in the same land trust, a different land trust, or even in your individual name, because that beneficial interest is disregarded for tax purposes. So that's really the key there. There's a relatively new animal on the street. Actually, it's not that new. It goes back to 2004. And it's called the Delaware Statutory Trust. This is something that's designed to acquire generally a very large asset or a portfolio of large commercial property. And you would essentially be selling your real estate, doing a 1031 exchange, and buying a beneficial interest in a Delaware statutory trust. That beneficial interest, just like a land trust, that beneficial interest is considered a disregarded entity for tax purposes and qualifies as the purchase of real estate for 1031 exchange treatment. So the Delaware Statutory Trust does also qualify. This episode is sponsored by my good friend Joel Owen with nnninvest.com. Are you looking to invest in triple net properties but don't know where to start? Perhaps you have a 1031 exchange with pressing deadlines. We all know how that goes. NNN Invest is a leading company in the field of triple net retail investing in syndication in the United States. Their proven 5-part framework not only maximizes the return, but also provides peace of mind before, during, and after the 1031 exchange transaction. Don't settle for less. Start the day at nnninvest.com. That's nnninvest.com. We've done quite a bit of work with Joel over the years, and he's done a very good job of taking care of our clients. Now let's expand on the taxpayer. We've talked about the entities that could qualify even if there's a change of legal title. We've talked about disregarded entities. And again, make sure your tax advisor reviews this to ensure that it is a disregarded entity and qualifies. The next step to this topic is, what if you own real estate inside some type of an entity, and that entity has decided to sell the real estate? The entity is going to break up and all the investors are going to go different directions. Now we have a challenge. The key here for 1031 exchange purposes is that the taxpayer, and again, we're trying to find out who is the real taxpayer. The taxpayer has to be able to say, I've owned this relinquished property for enough time to show I intended, or prove that I intended to hold this as rental, investment, or business use. That's really the key. And so to qualify for 1031 exchange treatment, we have to be able to show, if you're audited, that you had the intent to hold this property for some type of rental, investment, or business use. So if you own real estate inside of a corporation, and it doesn't matter if it's a C corporation or an S corporation, if it's in a general partnership, a limited partnership, Maybe it's an LLC with multiple members, so it's probably treated as a partnership. It's important to note that the entity is the taxpayer. So if the entity is going to sell the real estate, do a 1031 exchange, and then reinvest in replacement property as an entity, that's a plain vanilla transaction. It's very easy to structure, and the entity is the taxpayer. But for illustration purposes, let's take an LLC with multiple members. So generally, if you have an LLC, you have multiple members, it's treated as a partnership for tax purposes. That means that the LLC owns the real estate. The LLC is going to file a 1065 partnership tax return every year. Each individual member is going to get a K-1 that tells them what they report on their individual tax return. So the key thing there is the LLC is the taxpayer. It owns the real estate. It treats the real estate as rental, investment, or business use property. The individuals are merely members or owners of the entity, and they get cash flow from the entity. So let's assume that this LLC has said it is time to sell this real estate, but we do not want to stay together. We want to break up. We want to go different directions. Now we have an issue because we have an LLC that is the taxpayer. We have individual, let's say 4, 5, 6 individual members of this LLC that want to say, I take the cash proceeds, I want to go do a 1031 exchange. Unfortunately, they as individuals cannot say they sold real estate. The entity, the LLC, sold the real property, distributed the cash to the investors. All they're getting is a cash distribution. That doesn't qualify for 1031 exchange treatment. There may be all sorts of ways to address that issue. For example, maybe the LLC says, let's stay together, let's do a 1031 exchange, let's buy multiple replacement properties. We'll hold it at the LLC level for 2 years, 3 years, enough to straddle, let's say, 3 tax returns. And then we'll divvy up the property to all the investors. That's one way to deal with it. If we have enough planning time, perhaps a couple of years, the LLC could deed the property out of the LLC. So you actually record a deed into the individual names of the investors. Now they each become direct owners in real estate as tenants in common with each other. The LLC no longer owns real estate, but we need to hold title that way long enough to prove their intent was to hold for rental, investment, or business use. So our recommendation would be to hold for 2 years. That straddles 3 tax returns, very solid proof. And then when you sell, you can each decide what to do. Some can cash out, some can do 1031 exchanges, but they can all go their individual way. Both of those are not usually practical. There's usually some kind of a method or structure or goal or objective in the middle there somewhere. So we have to look at other potential options. So the message here really is be careful. We need to define who is the taxpayer and then decide from there, where do we go? How do we fix it, et cetera. It might be something, excuse me, like a redemption agreement. It might be something where the LLC says, let's redeem, let's buy back or buy out those partners who don't want a 1031 exchange. And if the other partners who are left behind do want a 1031 exchange, let's redeem those out who don't. Let's buy them out. So we do a redemption agreement of some type. We buy them out. We pay for that by deeding them their percentage in the real estate. So now we have a tenants in common arrangement where we have 2 or 3 or 4 investors who are tenants in common as individuals with an LLC, and the LLC is a tenant in common with the rest of them. The LLC now has the remaining investors, owners, who do want a 1031 exchange and stay together. That's another option. And so when they sell and close on the sale, the individuals get their cash proceeds, they go away, they pay the tax, they're happy campers, and the LLC does a 1031 exchange. Those are just 3 examples of what could happen. This is a very complicated area. It absolutely requires that you get your tax and legal advisors involved. We'd be happy to jump on a conference call with them and walk through all of these issues to make sure that we're taking care of you and not causing future issues in the overall transaction. So again, this is a good way to look at the entire ownership of your property. Now is the time to ask the question, what is your exit strategy? Once you know what the exit strategy is it going to be a sell, cash out, and pay the tax? Is it going to be a 1031 exchange, or will it be something else? Then you meet with your tax advisor and find out what are the tax consequences. And again, most importantly, who is the taxpayer and what can we do with that? And then from there, you can make decisions moving forward. So that's a quick wrap on the 1031 exchange, unraveling the mysteries when it involves the taxpayer and what the options are. So thank you for listening to Go Ahead Ask podcast today. Again, if you love Go Ahead Ask, please like it, share it, forward it to your friends, etc. Subscribe to it. We always encourage questions or topics you want us to cover, or if you'd like to be on the Exeter Group podcast, please send us an email, ask@exeterco.com. The next episode is going to be, again, on qualified opportunity zone investment funds. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you again. Talk to you soon. Have a good week.
Thank you for listening to Go Ahead Ask with the Exeter Group. Join us for our next episode when we further unravel the mysteries of real estate.